Hello, this is Mike Smith. Welcome back to another Maya tutorial. This time we're going to take a look at animating cameras. So whether you are working on an animation or if you've finished it, it's never too early or too late to add some cameras in just to make some more interesting views. So I don't really have an animation here. I've just got some basic objects that we can just either pan around or zoom into. So to start with, if we go to create at the top of the screen, cameras, and then we've got three main types here. The top one camera is a fully manual camera that you can move around and add keyframes to. Camera and aim is a camera with an aim constraint, and you can either animate or keyframe the entire group, so both of these together, or you can keyframe the camera and the aim constraint independently. Camera, aim and up is the same thing as camera and aim, but you have an up constraint as well, so you can make the camera tilt left to right. So we'll have a look at just the first two in this tutorial, because camera, aim and up is basically the same as camera and aim. So if we click on camera, you'll find the camera will automatically go to the center of the grid. If we press 4 to go into wireframe, you can see your camera there. Now you can move, you can rotate, and you can scale that, and you can add keyframes to that like any standard object. So if you haven't already looked at my basic animation tutorials which feature the graph editor and just keyframes, have a look at those first, then try animating a camera. So we don't just want to move a camera here, we want to actually look through it and see what's going on. So if I press 5 to go back to shaded, to look through your camera, if we go just below the shelf where you have your polygon primitives, click on panels, go to perspective, and then there you've got your perspective view and you've got your camera 1. If we select camera 1, we know we're looking through it now because it says camera 1 at the bottom of the screen in green, and we can move around like we normally do. So it doesn't really look any different to our perspective view at the moment, but we can add some keyframes here and we can actually adjust the angle of the view. We can make a wider angle lens if we want some distortion. So before we begin adding keyframes, we need to set up a few things. We need to check our frame rate is set to 24 frames per second. If you haven't yet done that, if you look at the bottom right corner of the screen, you'll see a white box with a red running character. Click on that. That's your animation preferences, and make sure your playback speed is set to real-time 24 FPS, frames per second. Click on save. We now need to make sure our outliner is open, so go to Window, Outliner, and we need this to actually select our camera, because once you're looking through it, you won't see the camera to actually physically click on. So we need that here so we can select either the camera or our other objects. It's a good idea to title your camera as well, simply because if you end up with, for example, 5 cameras, they'll just be called the default names, camera 1 to camera 5, and you'll spend forever just clicking on those, seeing what they do. So double click on your camera 1 in your outliner and give it an appropriate name. I'll just call this one pan 1 because I want it to pan just left to right. Next, we need to open up our resolution gate. That's to see exactly what we can get in our camera view. So if I click on view below our shelf, go down to camera settings, and you've got resolution gate here. Once we select this, we can actually turn it off by going back to no gate. So click on resolution gate, and you can see we've got this guide here. That means we will actually get everything that's in this. So you might want to spend some time actually positioning your objects and positioning your camera. Anything outside of that, we're not going to get. So if we render this here, the render will actually stop at this white line at the top. So just make sure you position everything inside that. Now it's important to know about aspect ratio and resolutions as well. It's important to know what resolution you're requiring at the end of your animation. So when you go to render this, you need to know whether it's HD 720, 1080 or a different type of resolution. So we can have a look at that now. If we go to Window, Rendering Editors, Render Settings, we have, currently this is set on HD 720, the default is HD 540. Now either one of these three HD resolutions are all exactly the same aspect ratio, that's 16:9. If I try something different though, if I select one of these, you can see it dramatically changes the shape of our resolution gate. If we go down to, let's say, A4, we even get a portrait resolution gate. So it's important to know what resolution you require at the end, or at least which set that falls into. So if you're not sure if it's 720 or 1080, it doesn't matter too much because they're both exactly the same aspect ratio. So just select either one of those. Close that. You'll also find if you deselect your camera, so if I click on the background, our resolution gate goes green instead of white. So now there's nothing selected. Just like objects, if you don't select an object, you can't adjust it and you can't add keyframes. So select your camera, currently called Pan 1, from our outliner, and we can now add some keyframes. So if I want that to start on, let's say, frame 20, press S to add a keyframe. If I want it to stop on frame 80, select frame 80 and press S to add another keyframe, and then we can just move our camera. So we could even zoom out and rotate around a bit, press S again, rewind your animation and press play, see how it looks. It's a common mistake that I've seen, which is people moving cameras far too quickly. So practice this, try to make nice slow movements. It's a real shame when people spend ages making an animation and then they move the camera far too quickly because you can't see what's going on. So have a think about how long you want your final animation to be. Remember, there's 24 frames per second. 120 frames is 5 seconds. 240 is 10. It gives you a rough starting point for how many frames you might require. You can move keyframes as well. If you select it by holding Shift and then click on your keyframe, you have to click just to the right of the red marker. We can now move this. So less frames means it happens sooner. More frames means it takes longer to happen, so you get a slower camera movement. You can also delete keyframes as well by Shift, selecting it, right click and then delete. So we can now have a look at a different type of camera. If we go to Create, Cameras, Camera and Aim, you'll find if we have a look at our outliner first of all, we actually have a group. So I'm going to double click on that and I'll give it a title. So we could just call that Cam Aim. Give it a title, anything you want, as long as you know what it is just by looking at the name. If we expand that group, you've got just the default Camera 1 and then Camera 1 Aim. So give them another title. Maybe it's Zoom 1, and then you want to call your aim constraint maybe Zoom 1 Aim. Anything. It really depends on what it is you're trying to do, what it is you're trying to achieve, or the movement of the camera. So if we now select the group, and I'm just going to use our move tool to move that up above our object, we can have a look at that. So you can see here you've got your camera that we can move around, and we have our aim constraint. So wherever I move the camera, it will always aim at that aim constraint. Now that can be quite useful if you had, for example, vehicles or characters walking along. You can even just animate or keyframe the aim constraint itself, which means you have a stationary camera that just rotates and it will always aim at that constraint. So you could even have a character or a vehicle moving along, and then you can use parenting to parent this aim constraint to your moving object. So you don't even need to use keyframes. You might want to have a look at my constraints and parenting tutorial to learn how to do that, but it's easy enough to do. Now, one thing you might need to be aware of with this is if you're looking through your camera with an aim constraint. So if I select my camera, go back to panels, perspective, click on your Zoom 1 camera or whatever you've titled it. If we're looking through it, we first need to set our resolution gate again. So go to View, Camera Settings, Resolution Gate. You can see your aim constraint in the middle here. Now, if I hold Alt, left click and then rotate around, if I add keyframes there, that's just moving the camera and not the aim constraint. However, if I hold Alt and middle click to pan around, that is actually moving the entire group. So just be aware, if you're animating this and you actually move the entire group, it could upset your position of your aim constraint. So I find a camera and an aim constraint, they work best if you're just animating one rather than both, but give it a go. See what you can find out with that. The last thing I'll show you, if I go back to my original camera, so I'm going to select my Pan 1, I'll go back to Panels, Perspective, and click on Pan 1 to actually look through it. Now we can actually see our other camera up here, but we can ignore that for now. If I just reposition this, I'm going to delete all the keyframes as well. So I'll double click in our timeline, I'll right click and delete, and that removes all keyframes that are visible there. We want to have a look at the focal length of the camera. So if I go to my attribute editor, now you don't really need to know much about physical cameras or photography or anything like that to understand this. You just need to experiment. So if we have a look, we've got camera attributes and we've got focal length here. The default is 35. If we change that, if we go any lower, if I go down to say 20, then press enter. If we have a look, straight away you can see the grid has some distortion. If we rotate around, it almost stretches towards the corners. If you go low enough, you actually get a fisheye effect. If I go down to maybe 8, if we zoom into our object, you can see we've got a lot of distortion. And you can actually make objects look completely different. So I'm just going to select this object and I'm just going to zoom in a bit more. And then if I rotate around, you can see lots of distortion there. So have a bit of fun with that, see what you can do. Just experiment, make a note of what numbers you're typing in. If I just go back to my camera here, go back to 35, and you can see the difference straight away. If you go too high, if I go up to maybe 100, it almost looks like there's no depth. It makes objects look quite unnatural and a bit flat. So just try it out for yourself, see what happens. And something that can be quite fun is you can actually keyframe this focal length. That applies to almost any attribute. All you have to do is actually set it to what you want and then right click on the word's focal length, and then we have this option here, set key. That's the same as adding a keyframe by selecting an object and pressing S. The only reason we have to do it differently up here is because a focal length is not a physical object, it's an attribute. You'll find there by setting a key, it's highlighted red, just to let you know there's a keyframe there. Also you can see an actual red marker in our timeline or our time slider down here too. So have a bit of fun with that, see what you can do. Make some notes of what you're experimenting with as well. screenshot some of these settings if it helps you, and just remember, some slow movements are always better. A fast camera can really spoil an animation. Okay, have some fun, try and learn something new.